Hello, everybody. I'm Yara Shahidi, and I'm so excited to be here and join Fair Fight Action as a part of Hot Call Summer. It is an incredible campaign to protect our freedom to vote. Now, I know a lot has been happening in the news and such, but if you've been paying attention, you know that our right to vote has been attacked. And oftentimes the successes of our last election is exactly what many elected officials are targeting to make sure that we don't have the same access to vote. And so the Hot Call Summer campaign is of extreme importance. Since Fair Fight Action launched it, you all made over 50,000 calls to your senators. That is incredible. It is partially why the Democratic Party had to get on the same page to present the For the People Act last month. And so while we're making great steps forward, we know the work is not done, which is exactly why Fair Fight Action has launched Hot Call Summer 2.0, which means we are going to keep texting, calling, organizing. It is important to push forward not only the For the People Act, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is why I'm so excited to be here with you all today, because I will be speaking with the incredible leader, Stacey Abrams, who is joining us from Atlanta, where her and her organization, Fair Fight Action, have been on the front lines. You all know how indebted we are to them and their work, making sure that all of our communities are represented and have access and protection to make it to the polls. And tonight we're going to talk all things democracy, partisan gerrymandering, and why it's important to have fair representation and solutions to protect our freedom to vote. If any of those words scare you, do not worry, do not shy away, because it will all be explained tonight. And now I am honored to introduce Fair Fight Action founder and former Georgia House Minority Leader, Stacey Abrams. Hello, Leader Abrams. How are you?
Hello. I am well. How are you?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
Well, we are always excited to be in your presence and just always grateful for the incredible work you do.
Thank
While
you.
being a student and a star and an activist, you're showing off just a little bit, but we'll forgive you.
Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. And as you listed my things, you're just saving democracy and such other casual things. And I know we wanted to start by just helping arm our audience with some basic terminology, make sure they understand what gerrymandering is, what some of the terms we'll be using tonight are, so that we can all be on the same page.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's think about a room. You're a group of you are standing in an auditorium, and they're going to put you in a room. And so you've got to figure out whose room you're going to be put into. You've got some folks who live in a community where they've got great access to clean water, they've got good roads, their bridges, none of them are falling down, they're all happy. And then you've got another group of people who live where the water has lead in it, and where they haven't had paving done on their streets in years, where they don't remember the last time a politician bothered to speak to them. If you live in that second community, which room do you want to be in? The room where everything is great for everyone else, so they don't really have to talk about it? Or a room where if you get together, you all can elect someone who actually understands your experiences and willing to work for you? Well, that's redistricting. Redistricting is every 10 years deciding which room every single voter goes into. Those are called districts. And gerrymandering happens when they try to pick the room you go into, not based on what you need, but based on what the politician wants to do. So if you have a politician who says, I don't think that we should be responsible for paving roads in poor areas, I don't think we need to deal with climate change because it's not real, I don't really believe a woman has the right to protect her own body. If that's the person that gets to decide which room you go into, the likelihood that that person is going to listen to you once you're in the room together is zero. And so gerrymandering happens when the politicians get to pick the voters in their room, as opposed to the voters getting to pick the politician who best reflects their needs. That's gerrymandering. Going into the room is redistricting. And all of this is based on the 2020 census. There you go.
That's a great way to look at it and to understand why it's so important and why something that seems so large and hefty actually affects us on such an intimate and community level. I know we'll continue talking about gerrymandering and redistricting in just a moment, but the one thing I want to talk about is, we just left a huge election year. It's not midterm year yet. So many people may be thinking, why in the world are we still talking about voting? Why are we in the same conversation? I thought we put all of our energy towards this last general election. But the one thing that you and Fair Fight Action have proven to everybody is there's no such thing as an off season, and some of our most important work is done in this time. So just for everyone listening right now, can you tell us a little bit more about Hot Call Summer and why the timing is important? Why should we be calling our senators now?
So if you're listening to this, you have probably gotten this message, but I want to put it out there one more time. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks say, I'm not into politics, and they may vote in big elections, but they're like, I'm not in politics. Problem is, politics is into you. Politics is a stalker. Mm-hmm. And politics happens all the time because politics is nothing more and nothing less than deciding how we live our lives in a society. So everything from where you can go, how you can park your car, to who gets to be in charge of whether you live or die happens because of this. And what is so important is that young people turned out at such extraordinary rates in 2020. It scared so many politicians. Mm-hmm. You'll hear a lot about how the fighting over voting rights is about whether Trump won or not. He's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with who won or who lost. It has everything to do with who showed up. And because young people showed up in such dramatic numbers, because people of color increased their participation so much, we have become inconvenient. And so the whole point of this voter suppression action is because too many people decided that this country belonged to them and they should be heard. Mm-hmm. And so in response, we have seen bills, legislation passed in 18 states already, with more bills pending across the country that would make it harder for every one of those communities to vote. Young people, people of color, the disabled, the poor. If they find you inconvenient, they're trying to make sure you don't speak up. Mm-hmm. And so Hot Call Summer is about making sure we can fix the pieces they're breaking. So across the country, state legislatures are taking action to make it harder to vote. Mm-hmm. And instead of going state by state to try to fix it, which can take years, we're asking the federal government to do one of the reasons we have a federal government, which is to fix it for everyone at the exact same time. And there are two bills to do that: the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Mm-hmm. And Hot Call Summer is all about making sure that every person, especially young people, know that politics is stalking you and is still into you, but that we've got to do our best work right now to make sure those we've already hired, already elected, do their jobs to protect us all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that breakdown. And I think it's important to note that just like you said, our Senate is who is in charge of our districting and preventing partisan gerrymandering. So you've helped us just break down, first of all, what is redistricting, what is gerrymandering. But I also know we're coming off of an anomaly of a year with the 2020 census, which was taken like no other census prior. So can you help us explain just kind of the stakes of why we need to be really adamant about focusing on fair redistricting and preventing partisan gerrymandering after this census year?
So Yara, you were incredibly helpful in 2020 as we reached out to young people across the country and encouraged them to respond to the census, to get their families to respond to the census. Mm-hmm. That's because in the Constitution, it's one of the few requirements of the Constitution that the federal government every 10 years has to count every person in the country. Mm-hmm. And the reason we do that is because based on that count, at every level of government, school board, city council, county commission, state legislature, and Congress, every one of those jobs will be based on drawing those lines for districts, as I said, those rooms that you go into to vote. Mm-hmm. And so what happened in 2020 was that we had a terrible census because of the unfortunate behavior of the Trump administration trying to weaponize the system, the census, to stop communities of color and immigrant communities from participating, because of COVID, where unfortunately people were scared and they were just inaccessible because a lot of folks had to move and consolidate. So we had lots of challenges. We know that this census may not be as accurate as previous censuses, but we also know that more people of color actually participated. And so we have a real opportunity to be seen this time. Now, with that as the baseline, every 10 years, based on the census, we have to redraw all of the lines, because every 10 years we get bigger as a country. People move around. You want to shuffle everything up and redraw it. And so where we are right now is that because 2020 was a census year, 2021 is the year we draw the lines. The problem is that the same people who are working so hard to stop us from being able to vote, who are leading these voter suppression efforts in the states, the same Republican legislatures, they're also the people in charge of drawing the lines in most states. In Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and Texas, 20% of all of the representation in Congress will be determined based on the lines drawn in just those 4 states. And so what we have to pay attention to is making sure that when they draw those lines, they don't draw those lines to benefit just the Republican Party, or worse, they don't draw those lines to segregate and isolate communities of color. It's called breaking or cracking. We don't want them to be separated from one another so that they can't share information and vote together to elect representation that reflects their community needs.
And I think what's interesting is somebody who has been in the voting work world, gerrymandering and talking about redistricting was one of the first times I saw such a clear example of why what happens on the community level matters and has repercussions for years, and given the policy that is trying to be passed for generations. And so it is a great first touch point for people that may just be starting to pay attention or feeling activated from this last election to really double down and figure out how we can be of service in this time. And to your point with this last census, I know where I'm from in California, it was the first time people were discussing not counting our undocumented population. And so knowing just how we'd seen these kind of egregious violations of justice happen, the importance of focusing on redistricting right now. And so you've helped explain, whether it be the example of having lead in your water, people being able to ignore our voices, what's generally at stake. But I also know this year comes with really specific issues. And so are there specific things that are at stake when you silence voters and when you silence citizens of color?
So let's think about 3 things that are top of mind. COVID is one. If we think about all of those school districts where teachers are being, 2 pieces to COVID. So you think about all the school districts where there are questions of whether children have to wear masks, whether they will be protected from COVID-19, whether the educators in their classrooms and the people who work around them have to protect them. That's often decided by the school board. Well, gerrymandering happens not just in Congress, it happens at that level. And so if you know that your school system may not have taken the best care of all of the kids in your community, the person who gets to speak for you on that school board gets determined based on the way those lines are drawn. The other part of that is the critical race theory debate. And it's not truly a debate. It is an attack on people of color trying to make certain our stories aren't included in American history. The people who decide whether or not our stories will be told, whether the true history of our nation, the complicated, wonderful, messy, to your point, egregious and sometimes victorious and miraculous story of our nation gets told, it's based on who's on the city council, city council, school board, and the state legislature. And so gerrymandering decides who's going to be in charge of that. The other thing I would point to is the fact that we've had floods, we've got extreme heat, we have had extraordinary examples of climate change this year. The decision to respond is going to be based on who gets elected to Congress, because we can't solve this community by community. We need national action. And so if we have lines drawn that give people who do not believe in climate change complete power over our legislature, that's another decade without action. And we know today that if we continue not to act, the next generation is going to be in dire straits. Those are just 2 examples. And the third one I'll give you is this. The George Floyd Policing Act has been languishing in the House and Senate. And part of that is determined on the House side, the U.S. Congress House side. It's based on who's in office. Gerrymandering doesn't affect the Senate because the Senate is elected statewide, but it affects who's in the House. And if we can't get people in the House who are going to consistently fight for these rights, then we will lose the opportunity to start to address the challenges of law enforcement brutality and the issues facing so many of our communities. Those are just a handful of examples, but every single day when you think about pain points in your life, things that are too difficult that you wonder, why can't this be simpler? It's probably because of who was elected to make that choice simpler. And if we get to elect the people who see us and value us, then we are more likely to get the solutions that save us.
Those are really relevant examples, especially because I know for so many of us and many of the people that gravitate towards your work and Fair Fight Action, that's exactly why we came out in such great numbers to vote in the first place. So to know that so much of what we voted for is still at stake and we have the opportunity to help shape the future of that legislation is really important. And so I know we've laid out the problem and we've also tossed out some legislation names. And so whether it be the For the People Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, can you help break down why this legislation is important and why Congress has to pass it to protect us and our rights to vote?
So I'm going to use an example or an analogy used by my friend, Senator Raphael Warnock. And I'm going to misquote him a little bit. But what he said is, think about it this way. You've got to put out the fire, but you also have to start building the fire station. And that's how we need to think about the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The For the People Act has very basic provisions that say that no matter where you live in our nation, we believe that every American should have some basic rights when it comes to voting. The right to register automatically, the right to early voting, the right to mail-in balloting, possibly, the right to vote without having to jump through so many hoops in order to prove who you are, and the right to make certain that your ballot gets counted, even if you make a mistake because you got bad information and go to the wrong place to vote, that they don't throw out your ballot simply because you put it in the wrong box. That if you voted and you voted with good intention, it should count. It also will decide that partisan gerrymandering, that political parties don't get to pick your leaders, that they have to draw the lines based on your needs, not based on their power. So that's partisan gerrymandering. And the For the People Act will make sure that all of those things happen. And hopefully it will also protect election workers, and it will do the work of making sure that these laws that will allow people to overturn elections because they don't like the results, that those laws get overturned. And right now we've had 18 states pass 30 different laws. And right now, without the For the People Act, those laws take effect and will affect every election, especially the elections in 22 and the presidential election in 24. So that's the For the People Act. That's putting out the fire. So if we get the For the People Act, we can put out the fire and many of those laws will go away. But the problem is, just because you get rid of some bad doesn't mean bad doesn't try to come back. And that's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. What that act says is that if you try it again, you've got to get permission. The Justice Department would be responsible for looking at bills that would advance voter suppression. And you'd have to be pre-cleared. You'd have to get permission to try to suppress the right to vote. And when it comes to drawing the lines for redistricting, which is incredibly important, you'd have to get permission. They'd have to look at your map and say that map is actually fair to everyone, or that map is in violation of these rules. And for people of color in particular, this is critical because over and over again, since the 1960s, we have seen maps drawn to hurt communities of color. And it's been the Justice Department that stands up and says, no, this isn't fair. You can't do this. It happened in 2019, between the 2011 redistricting heading into 2019, we saw 3 different states have to fix their maps because their maps unfairly targeted communities of color. Well, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would make it the law of the land that in states that had bad histories, they have to get permission to change the laws, and they have to get pre-clearance. They have to get permission to do redistricting, and that no matter where you live, that we would have a level playing field so that with the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act working together, you put out the fire and you have the right and the ability to respond to new fires when they get set.
Okay, and it's really helpful to understand that kind of the position we're in now is having to fix something retroactively, knowing that there are already 30 laws passed and we're trying our hardest to work against them, whereas the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is making sure that we don't have to keep responding, but we can be really proactive.
Exactly.
And so it's really helpful to understand why these two go hand in hand, why it's not just pushing one and the other. But the other thing I'd like to know is, I remember when the For the People Act was announced, it had the sign-on of every important person, all of our favorite celebrities, our legislators, people that we've seen with huge platforms. But I know right now we're talking about the importance of every single person, every single voter, every single community member. So why is the support from our favorite folks not enough? And what can the people who are tuning in today, who are community organizers, who are students, anything in between, how can they help push this legislation over and to the finish line?
We have to remember that the importance of voices like yours and those celebrities and those big names is to amplify.
Mm-hmm.
But you're only amplifying something if the people need to hear it.
Right.
And for politicians, the people who get to decide what's going to happen, the U.S. Senate members that we're asking you to call, ultimately they speak for us.
Mm-hmm.
And we want them to say what we need. And that means they need to hear from us.
Mm-hmm.
It is wonderful to have famous people saying things out loud, but they only get one vote.
Right.
Your votes are the votes that matter the most because they're the least expected, which makes them some of the most valuable voices. Mm-hmm. When you hear from someone that you haven't heard from in a really long time, you're going to pay an extra bit of attention. And for political leaders, when they hear from young people who have taken the time to reach out and say, I see you, that means you see them now, which means you will see them at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm.
And if they want to keep their jobs, you're demanding that they do their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's so important. As someone who used to be in office and might be one day again, I will tell you that when politicians hear from voters who care enough to take the time to reach out, we pay extra special attention to what they need. Mm-hmm. You can see something on television or hear about it on the radio, but when a person, especially a young person, says, this matters to me, that means that it matters not only to them, but to their friends, to their family. It means that I should pay a lot of extra attention. And that's why these 50,000 calls that have already been made are so important. Because every time you speak up, every time you reach out, even if their answer is no, they're a little more worried every day that you're going to keep paying attention and keep being engaged. Mm-hmm. And that's how we have found the most change is made. Because when people have to be worried about what you're going to say or do, they're going to do as much as they can to make sure you're happy with their behavior.
Mm-hmm. And it's so crucial to be able to demystify in this time of social media what celebrity engagement is, how impactful it actually is, and go back to exactly like you're saying, the importance of the individual. Oftentimes, I know, especially in my generation, we can be prone to figuring out what is the largest thing we can do with the grandest scale. But what you're saying is it's literally the individual action. It's not a cliche, but it's truth, that every call matters, every action matters, and that every single person who's committed to this helps move us forward. And Leader Abrams, I just want to thank you for your time amidst such a busy schedule to continue being that voice. I know as somebody that had only recently turned 18 and suddenly am now 21, you have been the voice I've turned to help make sense of this political realm and know that there is hope in really transforming what politics looks like and how it engages with our communities. And I guess to everyone else who is tuning in, whether it be Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or any of the other many platforms this is on, I just want to do one final reminder. We had such a great education tonight, and I have a couple numbers to give you so that we can call our senators and that we can make sure we have our reminders for ourselves to know that there's no off season, but this is everyday action. So I'm gonna look at a paper for the first time because I do not want to get this wrong.
You've been fantastic. So go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so you can call your senator, get this every single day. It is not a bother, it is necessary. And so we must demand that they pass the For the People Act immediately, but also the act that you may not have heard of, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The number is 888 453-3211. I see it's at the bottom of our screen right now. So you can write that down or screenshot it, and you can call every day. Now, if you need a reminder for yourself, you text democracy. Yes, the word democracy to 33339. And you'll get a reminder once a day to make sure that you are connected to the work of Fair Fight Action and you are part of the Hot Call Summer campaign. And of course, this is just one of many events that you all are doing. So next Thursday, there is another live event that everyone should tune into. And make sure that you are on the email list, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, just getting these reminders, because this is how we share information and continue to push forward. That is all I have to say, other than I'm just honored to be in conversation with you, and thank you for such another informative conversation.
Yara, as always, it is a delight to be with you. And I just want to amplify one more thing. It matters. When you think about that friend who calls you and bothers you over and over again, eventually you just do what they want, so they'll leave you alone. We need our U.S. senators to feel that way. But more importantly, you should know it's working, because we moved that Senate and they were able to vote for moving the advancement, to move the For the People Act forward. And just today, there was news that they are thinking about how they can move the ball a little further down the line. But the time is now. The U.S. Census Bureau is going to release data at the basically mid-August, and that's going to be used to draw these lines. And the reality is we need the U.S. Senate to take action so that by the time these lines are drawn, the laws are in place to make sure the lines are fair. And this is not about any politician winning or losing. This is about the people having fairness in their action. And we only get fairness when we demand it. And I know that you all are extraordinary at making certain that fairness is part of the conversation. You did it in 2020. And if you lived here in Georgia, you did it again in 2021. And now is the time for Hot Call Summer to remind the nation that young people are here not only to save themselves, but to save all of us. And if we can get your voices amplified, and if we can get your voices into the U.S. Senate, we can get the For the People Act. We can get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We can get fair districts that reflect our needs, reflect our values, and allow us to pick our leaders, not to let politicians pick their voters. So thank you so much, Yara. Thank you, Persis, for doing the ASL translation. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.